Hi, I hope everyone's doing well. My name is Ariel Johnson, and this presentation I'm going to be talking about mass incarceration in America. Mass incarceration in America is costing billions of dollars each year. If we cut down the prison population, just imagine all the things we could do with that money. We could use some of that $1 billion and put it towards funding the education system or even fixing our roads. Mass incarceration, as defined by Oxford Bibliographies, is a phenomenon referring to American incarceration and its historically extreme rates of imprisonment, with concentration on minorities living in neighborhoods of disadvantage. Now we're going to take a close look at the numbers of mass incarceration. The United States makes up 5% of the world's population, while also making up 25% of the world's prison population. Feeding and providing care for the prison population today is very expensive. It costs an estimated $182 billion annually, with some institutions paying $100,000 per year per prisoner. These pictures over here are of a prison in California. They are so overpopulated that they have filled all the cells to capacity, and they're now buying bunk beds and placing them in the gyms for the prisoners to sleep. In 1980, the U.S. prison population was 500,000, and by 2013, it increased to a whopping 2 million. The incarceration rate in 2013 was 702 per 100,000. This made us the nation with the highest incarceration rate, and we hold this title to this day. In 2013, the second place went to Russia, and they had 470 per 100,000. In America, 41% of people over the age of 23 have been arrested at least once in their life, and there are over 2,500 people serving life sentences for crimes committed as juveniles. Over here, I have a picture of Christian Fernandez. Christian, who was 11 at the time of his arrest, was left home alone to care for his younger brother. He was charged for pushing him into a bookshelf 2 times, causing head trauma, and his brother succumbed to his injuries a few days later in the hospital. The state attorney of Florida at the time decided that Christian should be tried as an adult for first-degree murder. If he was found guilty, he would be sentenced to a mandatory life imprisonment without parole, and he is the youngest person in Florida to be charged as an adult for murder. Incarceration rates for females is 126 per 100,000, and for males it's 1,325 per 100,000. In America, men have a higher chance of being arrested, but we also have the highest rate of incarcerated women compared to any other nation. Since men are more likely to be arrested in this country, I'm going to show the likelihood of imprisonment for men dependent upon their race. 1 out of 17 white men will be arrested at least one time in their life. Latino men have a 1 in 6 chance of being arrested at least once in their life. And Black men have a 1 in 3 chance of being arrested at least once in their life. So now I'm going to talk about where mass incarceration in prisons came from and where it all started. Around the 1970s, when tough on crime policies came on the scene, the prison population began to increase. I'm only going to cover 2 policies here today, and those are the war on drugs and 3 strike laws. First policy I'm going to discuss is the war on drugs. The term war on drugs was coined by Nixon in 1970. Here's a quote from him. He said, "We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number 1 in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs." Nixon used this so-called war to criminalize the anti-war protesters and the African American community. Over here is a quote from one of his assistants during his presidential term. He said, "You want to know what this was really all about? Nixon had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin and criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. In 1981, Reagan became president and the war intensified from here. They began showing campaigns for anti-drug programs and things of that nature, including Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. Shortly after his election was the introduction of crack cocaine. With the introduction of crack cocaine came mandatory sentence times. These were set times established for crack cocaine and powder cocaine, but crack cocaine, which was cheaper and more popular with lower class and minorities, was sentenced far harsher than powder cocaine. According to the mandatory sentence times, 5 grams of crack cocaine would land you in prison for 5 years, but for 500 grams of powder cocaine, you would get the same penalty. This unequal sentencing led to an increase in Black and Latino prisoners, and they were also more likely to be sentenced to longer times. These cases of longer sentencing times is evident in our increasing elderly prison population. Of 2010, elderly prisoners made up 16% of the prison population, and the cost to care for these prisoners is extremely high. Today, 80% of drug arrests are for possession, with half being for the possession of marijuana. And from 1985 to 2000, drug offenses accounted for half of the rise in the prison populations. The next policy I'm going to cover is the 3-strike laws. California was the first to establish this law in 1993 after the kidnap and murder of Polly Klaas. Richard Davis, the man found guilty, had 2 priors. The first one was for an attempted kidnap in 1976, and the second was for a kidnap in 1984, both of which he served time for. The 3-strike law states that after someone with 2 prior violent convictions commits their 3rd felony, they are sentenced to a mandatory sentence of 25 years to life. An additional feature to this law is the 2nd strike, which doubles the sentence for second offenses, and about 24 states have already adopted this law. After just the first decade of this law being used, the prison population in California increased. They had over 4,000 3-strike prisoners and over 35,000 2nd-strike prisoners. Although this is supposed to apply to violent offenses, some people have been convicted under the 3-strike laws for minor offenses. And a popular case of this is the case of Jerry Williams. Jerry was sentenced to 25 years in prison for supposedly stealing a slice of pizza worth $1.25. After serving 5 years, a judge looked at his case and released him, but not very many people are as lucky as Mr. Williams. This law has not decreased the crime rates in the states it's enforced in, but it has managed to increase the prison population, and it has led to more long mandatory sentences for prisoners, and the cost to taxpayers is an additional $500 million a year. This chart shows the increase in prison population after both of these policies were applied, and you can see after both of them were applied, there's like an obvious increase in the populations. Now I'm going to talk about how we can end this cycle of mass incarceration in America. The common theme these tough on crime policies have in common is mandatory minimum sentences. These laws are causing the prison population to soar. They've taken the power away from judges and given them to policymakers. So we need to renew the power to the judges and trust them to sentence people according to their individual case. We also need to stop building so many prisons. Some states, like California, have been spending so much building new prisons that they've had to cut funding for schools, and that's just crazy to me. In the U.S., after prisoners have served their time and are released, they are barred from receiving things such as student loans, public housing, and a job. Some states, they're not even allowed to vote. This causes them to have a high rate of homelessness and suicide, and relapse is also very common, and most people end up back in jail. We need to invest in more rehabilitation programs such as drug treatments, job training, education, and more. By investing in programs such as these, we can decrease the amount of people cycling through the system. Some states have already started banning the box on applications that ask if you have a criminal record. For those interested in making a change, some of the things you can do is educate yourself. There are tons of books and documentaries and government records that you can look at to further inform yourself on the situation. Also, pay attention during elections. There have been many politicians lately campaigning to end mass incarceration. And there are also many communities you can join that are fighting against mass incarceration. There are many groups doing this, but two of the most popular are the ACLU, or the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Sentencing Project. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and have a nice day.